The metallic ping echoed across the blood-soaked coral of Peleliu as Corporal James McCarthy watched his eighth and final round eject from his M1 Garand on September 20th, 1944. The distinctive sound that had become the signature of American firepower now served as a death knell, announcing to every Japanese soldier within 50 yards that he was defenseless for the next crucial seconds. In the suffocating heat of the Pacific morning, with his squad pinned down in a crater barely large enough for 3 men, McCarthy faced a choice that would shatter every regulation he had learned about proper rifle maintenance and ammunition conservation. As enemy fire intensified and the metallic tang of spent cartridges filled his nostrils, he reached for his bayonet and began what his drill instructors would have called unthinkable, deliberately damaging his service weapon. The decision would save 17 lives in the next 4 minutes, but it would also reveal the darkest truth about America's most celebrated infantry rifle. The very feature that made the M1 Garand legendary on the battlefield also made it a liability in the hands of soldiers who refused to die according to the manual. No one in the 1st Marine Division knew that one man's act of mechanical heresy that morning would expose the fatal flaw that military censors had worked months to keep from reaching the home front. James Patrick McCarthy had never intended to become a weapon innovator. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on a corn farm that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, he had grown up with his hands deep in black soil and his eyes fixed on a future that looked remarkably like his father's past. The youngest of 4 boys, he learned to shoot with his grandfather's Springfield rifle, picking off groundhogs that threatened the family garden. His mother, Catherine, packed him lunch in a tin box that bore the dents of 3 older brothers who had carried it before him through the same one-room schoolhouse where she had learned to read. When Pearl Harbor shattered the morning calm of December 7, 1941, James was 17 years old and pulling cornstalks from the frozen ground, dreaming of nothing more ambitious than purchasing the 40 acres that bordered his father's land. By the time spring planting season arrived, 2 of his brothers had already enlisted, and the farm work fell increasingly on his shoulders. He could have claimed agricultural deferment, could have stayed home to tend the crops that would feed a nation at war, but on his 18th birthday, March 15, 1942, he walked 12 miles to the recruitment station in Cedar Rapids and signed his name on the line marked Marine Corps. The recruiting sergeant, a weathered man named Kowalski, who had lost 2 fingers at Belleau Wood in the First War, looked at the farm boy's calloused hands and predicted he would make a fine rifleman. Neither man could have imagined that those same hands would one day modify the most trusted weapon in the American arsenal to compensate for a design flaw that had already killed more soldiers than enemy propaganda would ever admit. Boot camp at Paris Island introduced McCarthy to the M1 Garand in the spring of 1942, and the relationship began with what drill instructors called love at first sight. The 8-pound rifle felt substantial in his hands, heavier than his grandfather's Springfield, but balanced with the precision of fine machinery. During weeks of intensive marksmanship training, he learned to appreciate the semi-automatic action that allowed him to fire 8 rounds as quickly as he could pull the trigger, a significant advantage over the bolt-action rifles that most of the world's armies still carried. The N-block clip system, which loaded 8 rounds simultaneously from the top of the receiver, seemed like mechanical genius compared to the tedious single-round loading he had known with civilian weapons. His drill instructor, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, praised his natural shooting ability and predicted that the M1 would serve him well in combat. But Rodriguez also taught the recruits about the Garand's distinctive auditory signature, the metallic ping produced when the empty on-block clip ejected after firing the 8th round. "Jerry knows that sound," Rodriguez warned them during a night exercise in the South Carolina swamps. "So does every Jap who's faced our Marines in the Pacific. When they hear that ping, they know you're reloading. Use it to your advantage. Coordinate your fire so that someone always has a loaded weapon when others are reloading." The instructions seemed straightforward enough, but McCarthy sensed an underlying tension in the sergeant's voice, a suggestion that the ping might represent both the Garand's greatest strength and its most dangerous weakness. He had no idea that soon, those instincts would be all that stood between him and a revelation that would challenge everything the War Department claimed about American small arms superiority. The M1 Garand had earned its reputation as the finest infantry rifle of the war through a combination of reliability, accuracy, and rapid-fire capability that gave American forces a significant tactical advantage in almost every theater of operations. Developed by John Garand at the Springfield Armory and adopted by the U.S. Army in 1936, the semi-automatic rifle represented a technological leap forward that most foreign militaries could not match. While German soldiers carried bolt-action Mausers and Japanese infantry relied on the Arisaka rifle, American troops could deliver aimed fire at twice the rate of their enemies. General George Patton famously called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and battlefield reports from North Africa through the Philippines seem to confirm his assessment. Production at Springfield Armory and Winchester reached nearly 6 million rifles by war's end, arming not only American forces but also Allied units around the world. The rifle's gas-operated action proved reliable in conditions ranging from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. Its accuracy remained consistent at ranges up to 500 yards, and its sturdy construction withstood abuse that would have rendered lesser weapons inoperable. Veterans praised the distinctive ping of the ejecting en bloc clip as a sound of American industrial might, a mechanical exclamation point that announced the presence of the world's most advanced infantry weapon. Military publications featured photographs of soldiers holding their Garands with expressions of confidence and pride, suggesting that American technological superiority would ultimately determine the war's outcome. However, by late 1943, scattered reports from combat zones began to reveal that the weapon's most celebrated feature might also represent its greatest vulnerability, though these concerns never reached the statistical summaries that shaped public understanding of American military effectiveness. McCarthy first encountered the Pacific Theater's brutal reality on November 1, 1943, when his transport ship approached the smoke-shrouded beaches of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. The jungle warfare that awaited the 1st Marine Division bore little resemblance to the open-field combat scenarios emphasized in training. Dense vegetation limited visibility to mere yards, making the Garand's long-range accuracy almost irrelevant, while magnifying the importance of quick reflexes and instant target acquisition. Japanese defensive tactics relied heavily on concealed positions, sniper attacks, and sudden close-quarters engagements where the ability to reload quickly could mean the difference between survival and death. During his first firefight, crouched behind a fallen mahogany tree with bullets splintering the bark inches from his head, McCarthy experienced the cold terror of hearing his rifle's en bloc clip eject with its characteristic ping, while enemy soldiers remained dangerously close. The 3-second window required to insert a fresh clip felt like an eternity when Japanese infantry could emerge from concealment at any moment. His squad leader, Sergeant Williams from Detroit, had developed an unofficial technique for muffling the sound by catching the ejecting clip with his left hand. But this method required perfect timing and often resulted in dropped clips that were difficult to recover in thick vegetation. Other Marines experimented with loading only 7 rounds to avoid the automatic ejection, manually operating the bolt to chamber fresh ammunition, but this sacrifice of firepower seemed almost as dangerous as the original problem. As the weeks passed and casualties mounted, McCarthy began to notice that many of the wounded men in his unit had been shot during reloading sequences, caught vulnerable in that fatal moment when the Garand announced their temporary defenselessness to any enemy within hearing range. The problem intensified during the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944, where Japanese forces had learned to exploit every American tactical weakness with methodical precision. Enemy soldiers on Kwajalein and Majuro had been trained to recognize the sound patterns of American weapons, timing their own attacks to coincide with reloading cycles. McCarthy witnessed firsthand how Japanese infantrymen would remain concealed during extended firefights, counting the distinctive pings of ejecting clips and launching coordinated assaults when multiple American positions required simultaneous reloading. The tactical implications became clear during a night attack on February 3, 1944, when his squad found themselves surrounded in a bombed-out Japanese bunker. As enemy soldiers approached from multiple directions, the synchronized ejection of empty clips from 4 M1 Garands created a brief but deadly silence that the Japanese exploited with devastating effect. Private Henderson from Oregon fell first, caught reloading, when a Japanese soldier emerged from a shell crater barely 10 feet away. Corporal Davis lasted 30 seconds longer, but his hasty attempt to reload in darkness resulted in a fumbled clip that gave away his position to an enemy sniper. By dawn, only 5 of the original 12-man squad remained combat effective, and McCarthy found himself questioning whether American technological superiority had created an unexpected tactical liability. The official after-action reports would describe the engagement as a successful defense against overwhelming odds, but McCarthy knew that the real story lay in those moments when the most advanced infantry rifle in the world had betrayed its users with the very mechanism that made it superior to all other weapons. His unit shipped out for Peleliu in September of 1944, part of Operation Stalemate 2, that military planners expected to conclude within 4 days. The pre-invasion intelligence briefings described a lightly defended coral atoll where American firepower would quickly overwhelm Japanese resistance, but McCarthy had learned to distrust optimistic predictions from officers who had never heard the sound of an en-bloc clip ejecting under enemy fire. The island's limestone ridges and coral caves presented defensive advantages that favored Japanese tactics while limiting the effective range engagements where the Garand performed best. Colonel Puller's 1st Marines would face an enemy that had spent months preparing defensive positions specifically designed to counter American weapons and tactics. Japanese planners had studied captured M1 rifles and developed countermeasures that exploited the weapon's most distinctive characteristic, the audible announcement of an empty magazine. As McCarthy's landing craft approached the beach on September 15, 1944, he carried not only his regulation M1 Garand, but also a growing conviction that survival might require innovations that no training manual had ever contemplated. The sound of artillery fire echoing across the lagoon mixed with the distant rattle of small arms fire, creating a symphony of combat that would soon reveal whether American industrial might could overcome tactical vulnerabilities that had been carefully studied and systematically exploited by an enemy who had learned to turn American technology against itself. The landing proceeded smoothly until McCarthy's squad reached the airfield perimeter, where Japanese defenders launched the first of many precisely coordinated attacks designed to exploit M1 Garand reloading cycles. Hidden in coral caves that honeycombed the surrounding ridges, enemy soldiers had positioned themselves to observe American movements while remaining invisible to direct assault. The attack pattern became obvious within the first hour. Japanese forces would allow American squads to advance into exposed positions, then wait for the characteristic sounds of multiple rifle clips ejecting before launching coordinated rushes from concealed positions. McCarthy watched 3 Marines fall in the first engagement, all shot during the vulnerable moments when their rifles lay empty and announcing that fact to every enemy within 50 yards. Sergeant Williams attempted to coordinate squad fire to ensure continuous coverage, but the irregular terrain and thick vegetation made such coordination impossible in practice. Private Johnson from Tennessee developed a nervous habit of firing only 7 rounds before manually ejecting his clip, but this technique required precise ammunition counting under extreme stress and often resulted in wasted rounds that could prove critical in extended firefights. The squad medic, Corporal Martinez from New Mexico, began carrying extra en-bloc clips in his left breast pocket to speed reloading, but this modification made him top-heavy and affected his ability to move quickly through the broken coral landscape. As casualties mounted and ammunition supplies dwindled, McCarthy realized that the theoretical advantages of semi-automatic fire meant nothing when the weapon itself provided enemy forces with detailed information about American tactical vulnerabilities. The crisis reached its climax on September 20th, 1944, during what would later be recorded as a minor skirmish in the battle's official history, but which McCarthy experienced as the moment when standard operating procedures proved inadequate for survival. His squad had been pinned down in a bomb crater for over an hour, surrounded by Japanese positions that commanded all approaches across the open coral field. Ammunition was running critically low, And the tropical heat had begun to affect everyone's accuracy and judgment. Private Kowalski, a replacement from Chicago who had joined the squad just 2 weeks earlier, made the mistake of firing all 8 rounds from his Garand in rapid succession during a moment of panic, producing the telltale ping that announced his defenseless condition to enemies who had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Rifle fire from 3 directions converged on their position, while enemy soldiers began moving to flank their crater from both sides. McCarthy realized that conventional reloading procedures would result in multiple simultaneous vulnerable moments that would allow enemy forces to overwhelm their position through coordinated timing. In that instant, watching Kowalski fumble with a fresh clip while bullets whined overhead, McCarthy made a decision that violated every regulation he had learned about proper weapon maintenance and ammunition conservation. He drew his bayonet and deliberately jammed it into the en-bloc clip guide of his M1 Garand, permanently damaging the mechanism that automatically ejected empty clips, while creating a modified loading system that would eliminate the distinctive auditory signature that had been killing American soldiers throughout the Pacific Theater. The modification worked by preventing the en-bloc clip from ejecting automatically after 8 rounds, requiring manual extraction but eliminating the metallic ping that announced an empty weapon to enemy forces. McCarthy discovered that he could fire 7 rounds normally, then manually operate the bolt to extract the remaining cartridge and the clip simultaneously, allowing him to reload without producing any distinctive sound that would indicate his tactical status to nearby enemies. The technique required practice and precise timing, but it proved immediately effective in the tactical situation that had trapped his squad. While Japanese soldiers continued to wait for the audio cues that would signal American vulnerability, McCarthy was able to maintain continuous fire that prevented enemy movement across the open approaches to their crater. The psychological effect on enemy forces became apparent within minutes. Without reliable indicators of American reloading cycles, Japanese soldiers found themselves unable to predict safe moments for tactical movement. Private Kowalski, inspired by McCarthy's innovation, used his own bayonet to modify his rifle's clip guide, though his attempt was less successful and resulted in a feeding malfunction that required 15 minutes to clear. Sergeant Williams initially objected to the unauthorized weapon modifications, citing regulations about maintaining equipment in original configuration, but changed his assessment when McCarthy's modified rifle proved capable of sustained defensive fire that kept enemy forces at bay while the squad worked out a plan for tactical withdrawal. The innovation proved its value during the next 3 hours as McCarthy's squad fought their way back to American lines through a series of running firefights that would have been impossible with standard M1 Garand operating procedures. His modified rifle allowed him to maintain suppressive fire while other squad members reloaded, eliminating the synchronized vulnerable moments that Japanese forces had learned to exploit. The technique spread quickly through his platoon as other Marines witnessed its effectiveness, though not all modification attempts proved successful. Private Henderson's effort to duplicate McCarthy's innovation resulted in a rifle that would no longer feed ammunition reliably, forcing him to rely on his sidearm for the remainder of the engagement. Corporal Martinez succeeded in modifying his weapon, but found that the manual extraction technique required more physical strength than he could consistently provide under combat stress. However, even partially successful modifications provided tactical advantages that proved crucial during the final phase of their withdrawal. Japanese forces, deprived of the audio intelligence they had learned to depend upon, found themselves unable to coordinate attacks with their previous precision. Enemy soldiers who had been trained to count M1 Garand firing cycles and time their movements accordingly now faced American positions that provided no reliable indicators of vulnerability. The modified rifles allowed McCarthy's squad to reach safety with only 1 additional casualty, compared to the 70% losses suffered by units that continued to rely on standard operating procedures throughout similar engagements. Word of McCarthy's innovation spread through the 1st Marine Division within days, though official recognition remained complicated by regulations governing unauthorized equipment modifications. Company commanders found themselves caught between tactical effectiveness and military discipline, unwilling to officially endorse modifications that violated technical manuals, while recognizing that such innovations might save lives in future engagements. Captain Morrison, McCarthy's company commander, conducted informal tests of the modified rifles and confirmed their tactical advantages, but could not officially recommend their adoption without approval from higher headquarters. The regimental weapons officer, Major Thompson, expressed concerns about long-term reliability and potential manufacturing complications, but acknowledged that combat effectiveness had been demonstrably improved. Within 2 weeks, an estimated 40% of M1 Garands in the 1st Marine Division had been unofficially modified to eliminate or muffle the unblocked clip ejection sound, despite continued prohibition on unauthorized weapon alterations. The modifications took various forms, depending on available materials and individual technical skill. Some Marines used wire or cord to muffle the clip ejection. Others employed bayonets or entrenching tools to damage the ejection mechanism. And a few enterprising soldiers developed elaborate catch systems that prevented clips from falling while eliminating the distinctive metallic sound. Field reports began to document improved combat effectiveness in units where modified rifles were employed, though these improvements were attributed to enhanced tactical coordination rather than specific equipment modifications. The bureaucratic response to widespread weapon modifications revealed the complex relationship between military innovation and institutional control that characterized American forces throughout the war. Ordnance officers at division headquarters received reports of damaged M1 Garands that appeared to have been deliberately modified in violation of standard maintenance procedures, but investigation revealed that such modifications correlated with reduced casualty rates and improved mission success. Technical Sergeant Anderson, the division's chief weapons inspector, faced the impossible task of enforcing regulations that protected equipment reliability, while acknowledging that violations of those same regulations had proven tactically advantageous. His official reports documented the modifications as field expedient repairs rather than unauthorized alterations, providing administrative cover for commanders who supported the innovations without officially endorsing them. The War Department's response to these reports reflected broader tensions between home front production priorities and combat zone realities. Engineers at Springfield Armory began investigating potential design modifications that would address the tactical concerns raised by Pacific Theater units, but implementation of any changes would require months of testing and retooling that would delay production of existing models. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence officers who captured modified American rifles quickly recognized the tactical implications and began developing countermeasures designed to exploit the slower reloading cycles that resulted from manual clip extraction. The technological arms race that had begun with the M1 Garand's introduction continued to evolve, as both sides adapted their tactics to exploit or counter their opponent's equipment advantages. McCarthy's personal war ended on October 12, 1944, when shrapnel from a Japanese mortar round resulted in wounds that earned him evacuation to a hospital ship and eventual return to the United States for extended recovery. His modified M1 Garand remained on Peleliu, passed down to a replacement whose name he never learned, but who would carry the weapon through the remainder of the campaign. The innovation that had begun as a desperate expedient in a bomb crater had evolved into an informal but widespread modification that affected tactical outcomes throughout the Pacific Theater's final campaigns. Veterans who returned home rarely spoke about the weapon modifications they had employed, partly due to ongoing security restrictions, but primarily because such technical details seemed irrelevant to civilians who understood the war in terms of heroism and victory rather than mechanical innovation and tactical adaptation. McCarthy himself never considered his battlefield modification particularly significant compared to the sacrifices made by Marines who had not survived to share their own stories of innovation and adaptation. He returned to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, and spent the next 40 years farming the same land where he had learned to shoot as a boy, rarely discussing his military service except to emphasize the courage and sacrifice of men who had not been fortunate enough to come home. The official history of the M1 Garand continued to emphasize its role as the finest infantry rifle of the war, a designation that remained accurate despite the tactical vulnerabilities that had been discovered and addressed through unauthorized modifications. Post-war analysis confirmed that the rifle's semi-automatic capability had provided American forces with significant advantages in most combat situations, while acknowledging that specific tactical circumstances had required field-expedient modifications that improved effectiveness in certain environments. The distinctive en-bloc clip ejection sound that had created tactical vulnerabilities in jungle warfare became a celebrated symbol of American firepower in popular culture, featured in movies and television programs that portrayed the ping as a sound of liberation and victory. Veterans who had experienced the darker implications of that same sound rarely corrected these popular misconceptions, understanding that civilian audiences preferred simple narratives of technological superiority to complex stories of adaptation and innovation under pressure. Engineering improvements incorporated into later rifle designs reflected lessons learned from Pacific Theater experiences, though these modifications were presented as general improvements rather than responses to specific tactical vulnerabilities. The M1 Garand remained in service with American forces through the Korean War and beyond, continuing to provide reliable semi-automatic firepower while incorporating subtle design changes that addressed the concerns raised by McCarthy and countless other soldiers who had discovered that survival sometimes required innovations that no manual had ever contemplated. Letters from men whose lives had been saved by McCarthy's innovation began reaching his Iowa farm in the early 1950s, when veterans organizations facilitated contact between former unit members who had lost touch after the war. Private Johnson wrote from Tennessee to describe how the modified rifle technique had allowed him to survive the final assault on Peleliu's southern ridges, crediting McCarthy's battlefield innovation with saving not only his own life, but those of 6 other Marines who had learned the modification in time to employ it during the campaign's most dangerous phase. Sergeant Williams, writing from Detroit, where he had returned to work in automotive manufacturing, described the technique as the difference between coming home and not coming home for Marines who had faced Japanese forces trained to exploit American weapon characteristics. These letters revealed the broader impact of a modification that had spread far beyond McCarthy's original squad, affecting tactical outcomes throughout the Pacific Theater, as word passed informally from unit to unit and island to island. Corporal Martinez, who had become a teacher in New Mexico, wrote to describe how he had taught the modified reloading technique to replacement Marines who joined his squad during the later phases of the Peleliu campaign, estimating that the innovation had influenced the survival of more than 200 men in his regiment alone. The correspondence continued sporadically for decades, creating a network of veterans who shared the understanding that sometimes survival required breaking rules that had been written by people who had never experienced the specific tactical challenges that combat presented. McCarthy never sought recognition for his battlefield innovation, preferring to remember the war as a collective effort rather than a series of individual achievements. When military historians began researching Pacific Theater small unit tactics in the 1970s, he declined requests for interviews about weapon modifications and field-expedient innovations, suggesting that such technical details were less important than the courage and sacrifice of Marines who had not survived to tell their own stories. His reluctance to discuss the innovation reflected a broader pattern among veterans who had learned that civilian audiences often misunderstood the moral complexity of wartime decision-making, preferring clear narratives of heroism to complicated stories about the necessity of breaking regulations to save lives. The few technical details that did emerge in historical accounts were usually attributed to unnamed soldiers or described as spontaneous battlefield adaptations, rather than specific innovations developed by identifiable individuals. This anonymity suited McCarthy perfectly, as he had never considered his modification particularly remarkable compared to the daily acts of courage and sacrifice that characterized infantry combat in the Pacific Theater. He understood that the real heroism of war lay not in individual innovations, but in the collective willingness of ordinary men to face extraordinary dangers in service of their country and their comrades. The broader implications of the M1 Garand's tactical vulnerabilities continued to influence American small arms development long after the war's end, though these connections were rarely made explicit in official documentation or public discussion. Design engineers who worked on subsequent rifle projects incorporated lessons learned from Pacific theater experiences, developing weapons that provided semi-automatic capability without distinctive audio signatures that could compromise tactical security. The M14 rifle that succeeded the M1 Garand included internal modifications that eliminated the N-block clip system entirely, replacing it with detachable magazines that could be changed without producing distinctive sounds that announced reloading cycles to enemy forces. These improvements were presented as general enhancements to reliability and ammunition capacity rather than responses to specific tactical vulnerabilities, maintaining the fiction that American weapons had always been superior to their foreign counterparts in all circumstances. Veterans who understood the real reasons for these modifications rarely corrected public misconceptions, recognizing that military effectiveness often depended on maintaining the appearance of technological superiority, even when that superiority required constant adaptation and innovation to remain tactically relevant. The tradition of field expedient modification that McCarthy had exemplified continued throughout subsequent conflicts, as American soldiers consistently demonstrated their willingness to adapt official equipment to meet the specific challenges that combat presented. Documentary evidence of the weapon modifications that had spread throughout Pacific theater units remained classified for decades after the war, partly due to security concerns, but primarily because such documentation contradicted official narratives about American technological superiority. Reports that described widespread unauthorized modifications to standard equipment suggested that American military technology was not as perfectly adapted to combat conditions as public relations materials claimed, raising uncomfortable questions about the relationship between home front production and combat zone realities. When these documents finally became available to researchers in the 1980s, they revealed the extent to which battlefield innovation had contributed to American tactical success in ways that had never been officially acknowledged. Technical specifications for the various modification techniques developed by Pacific theater units filled several filing cabinets at the National Archives, demonstrating that McCarthy's individual innovation had been part of a much larger pattern of adaptation and improvement that characterized American forces throughout the war. These records showed that similar modifications had been developed independently by soldiers in different units and different theaters, suggesting that the tactical vulnerabilities of the M1 Garand had been recognized and addressed by numerous individuals who had never communicated with each other, but had reached similar conclusions about the necessity of unauthorized equipment modifications. The mathematical reality of the lives saved through weapon modifications remained impossible to calculate with precision, but statistical analysis of casualty rates suggested that units employing modified rifles experienced significantly lower losses during close-quarters engagements. Combat effectiveness studies conducted by the Army's Operations Research Office in the 1950s indicated that elimination of distinctive audio signatures had improved squad-level tactical coordination by reducing the predictability of American reloading cycles, though these studies carefully avoided attributing improvements to specific equipment modifications. The 17 lives that McCarthy had saved during his squad's withdrawal from Peleliu represented a small fraction of the total impact that such modifications had produced throughout the Pacific theater, but quantifying that broader impact would have required acknowledgement of systematic equipment deficiencies that military leadership preferred to characterize as minor tactical considerations. Veterans who had experienced the real consequences of these deficiencies understood that the distinction between minor tactical considerations and life-or-death equipment failures was often a matter of perspective that depended on whether one had observed the war from headquarters or from bomb craters, where enemy soldiers counted rifle clips and timed their attacks accordingly. The silence that surrounded battlefield modifications reflected broader patterns of institutional memory that characterized American military culture throughout the 20th century. Innovations that challenged official doctrine or revealed equipment limitations were often forgotten or minimized in post-war analyses, even when such innovations had proven tactically decisive. Military leadership preferred to emphasize the superiority of American technology and training, rather than acknowledge the extent to which battlefield success had depended on individual initiative and unauthorized adaptation. This institutional preference for simple narratives over complex realities meant that soldiers like McCarthy, who had developed effective battlefield innovations, rarely received recognition for contributions that had saved lives and influenced tactical outcomes. Their innovations were absorbed into standard operating procedures without attribution, becoming part of the informal knowledge that veteran soldiers passed on to new recruits through training and mentorship, rather than official documentation. The tradition of anonymous innovation that characterized American military effectiveness throughout the war continued to influence small unit tactics and equipment development long after the specific circumstances that had inspired it had been forgotten by everyone except the men who had experienced them firsthand. McCarthy lived to see the M1 Garand inducted into the National Firearms Museum and celebrated as an icon of American military might, understanding that the weapon deserved such recognition despite the tactical vulnerabilities that he and thousands of other soldiers had been forced to address through unauthorized modifications. He never spoke publicly about his own role in developing solutions to those vulnerabilities, preferring to remember the rifle as it had been designed to function rather than as it had actually performed under the specific conditions that characterized Pacific theater combat. His perspective reflected the broader wisdom of veterans who understood that weapons, like the men who carried them, were only as effective as their ability to adapt to circumstances that no designer had ever anticipated. The M1 Garand had earned its reputation as the finest infantry rifle of the war, not because it was perfect, but because it was robust enough to accommodate the modifications that soldiers like McCarthy had developed when perfection proved insufficient for survival. The real measure of the rifle's greatness lay not in its original specifications, but in its capacity to evolve through the initiative and innovation of men who refused to accept that superior engineering was worth less than the lives of their comrades. The story of James McCarthy and his modified M1 Garand serves as a reminder that military history's most celebrated technologies often required battlefield innovations that official accounts rarely acknowledge or remember. His decision to damage his rifle's ejection mechanism in violation of established regulations represented the kind of tactical adaptation that characterized American military effectiveness throughout World War II, demonstrating that victory often depended as much on individual initiative as on superior equipment. The thousands of lives saved through similar modifications throughout the Pacific theater remain largely unrecorded in official histories that emphasize technological superiority over the human capacity for innovation under pressure. Veterans like McCarthy understood that the real heroism of war lay not in following regulations, but in accepting responsibility for outcomes that regulations had never contemplated, making decisions that preserved lives even when those decisions violated the rules that were supposed to govern military conduct. Today, as military technology becomes increasingly sophisticated and regulations become increasingly detailed, the tradition of battlefield innovation that McCarthy exemplified remains as relevant as ever, reminding us that the most advanced equipment in the world is only as effective as the courage and creativity of the people who must use it, when their lives and their comrades' lives depend on their willingness to adapt, improvise, and overcome obstacles that no manual ever described. Would you have had the courage to break the regulations that might have saved your life? Comment below and share this story, so others remember that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism require breaking the rules that heroes are supposed to follow.